A beach in Anatolia, a camp of tents stretching for miles along the sand, thousands of fighting men, dozens of kings, not officers, not subordinates, kings, each one used to being the loudest voice in his own hall, each one from a city that had never taken an order from any of the others. And every one of them is waiting on the word of a single man. 10 years into a war they all expected to finish in a season. 10 years of dead friends, rotting ships, and no gold to show for it. Any one of them could have loaded his men onto the boats and sailed home. None of them did. That is the part of this story nobody can quite explain away. Not the war, not the horse. The fact that one man held that alliance together for a decade while it tried, again and again, to tear itself apart. His name was Agamemnon, and in 1876, a German businessman turned archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann knelt over a freshly opened grave in the Greek Peloponnese and found himself staring into a face of solid gold, a death mask laid over a man who had been in the ground for more than 3,000 years. Schliemann had no doubt what he was looking at. He fired off a telegram to a newspaper in Athens containing one line that would follow him forever. He had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. He was wrong. Modern dating puts that mask at roughly 1550 BCE, 3 to 4 centuries before the Trojan War is even traditionally supposed to have happened. Whoever that golden face belonged to, it wasn't the king from the poems. But here's the strange part. The name never came off. Walk into the National Archaeological Museum in Athens today, and the placard still reads Mask of Agamemnon. Even after the archaeology corrected him, nobody could quite let go of it, because Schliemann had accidentally found something almost better than a face. He'd found proof that the world behind the legend was real, because Mycenae was real. And Mycenae was rich beyond anything else in Bronze Age Greece. In the myth, Agamemnon is its king. Homer doesn't simply call him a ruler, he gives him a title, king of men, and describes his city with an epithet he repeats over and over, rich in gold. For centuries, that sounded like poetic flourish. Then Schliemann dug into the royal burial site now called Grave Circle A and pulled out 5 shaft graves holding 19 bodies, buried with a quantity of gold that genuinely didn't make sense for the period. Masks, cups, inlaid weapons, jewelry. More gold in one burial complex than had been recovered anywhere else in Bronze Age Greece. Homer's rich in gold wasn't invention, the dirt confirmed it. That's the line worth holding on to for the rest of this story. There is no inscription anywhere naming a King Agamemnon. No tablet, no seal, no contemporary record. What archaeology gives us is the stage, a genuinely powerful, warlike, fabulously wealthy Mycenaean civilization with fortress walls so massive that later Greeks assumed giants had built them. Everything we know about the man himself comes from Homer and the Greek tradition that grew around him. So let's take the myth on its own terms, because on its own terms, it's ruthless. How does one king end up commanding all of Greece? It starts before the war with something called the Oath of Tyndareus. Helen of Sparta had suitors, the best-connected, most dangerous young men in the Greek world, all competing for the same woman. Her father, Tyndareus, understood exactly how that ends. Choose one, and the rejected ones burn Sparta to the ground out of spite. So he made every suitor swear a binding oath first. Whoever Helen chose, all the others would defend that marriage if it was ever threatened. They swore, and then they went home and presumably forgot about it, the way people always do. Years later, Helen left with the Trojan prince Paris. And her husband, Agamemnon's brother Menelaus, called in every single one of those oaths at once. Suddenly the most powerful kingdoms in Greece were legally, sacredly obligated to go to war together. Someone had to actually assemble that. Ships, supplies, precedents, whose men marched where. Agamemnon, as the strongest king among them, took it. That's the thing people miss. He didn't inherit the Trojan War, he built it, and the price started before a single ship left Greece. The fleet gathered at Aulis, and the wind died, not for a day, for weeks. 1,000 ships sitting motionless on flat water while food ran down and an army of proud men began remembering they had homes. A seer delivered the reason. The goddess Artemis was offended, and she wanted payment before she'd release the wind. The payment was Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. In most versions of the story, he does it. He has her brought to Aulis, in some tellings under the pretense of a marriage to Achilles, and he kills his own child on an altar so his war can begin. The wind returned, the fleet sailed. Remember that. Everything that happens to Agamemnon for the rest of his life is the bill coming due for that morning. Now the war. And this is where most retellings badly undersell him. The Iliad doesn't open at the beginning of the siege. It opens near the end of it, with the Greek army about to destroy itself from the inside, and it starts with Agamemnon making a genuinely stupid decision. He's holding a captive woman, Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo. Her father comes with ransom and begs. Agamemnon humiliates him and sends him away. So the priest prays, and Apollo answers with plague. Greek soldiers start dying in their own camp day after day until Agamemnon has no choice but to hand her back. And here's where pride finishes the job. Forced to give up his prize in front of the entire army, he takes someone else's to compensate, Briseis, a woman awarded to Achilles, the single deadliest human being on that beach. Publicly humiliated, Achilles does the one thing that costs the Greeks everything. He stops fighting. He walks to his tent and sits down, and the greatest warrior alive watches the Trojans push his own side back toward the ships. This is usually where the story stops and calls Agamemnon an arrogant fool, and he was. But then Book 11 happens. With Achilles gone, Agamemnon doesn't retreat behind his rank or send other men forward in his place. He arms himself and goes into the line, and Homer gives him a full Aristia, an extended sequence of peak heroic combat reserved for the greatest fighters in the poem. He cuts through the Trojan front, he kills named warriors in graphic, specific detail. He drives the Trojan army back toward its own walls, and he keeps going until he takes a wound serious enough to force him off the field. Whatever else the myth says about him, it never lets you call him a coward. When his authority failed to hold the army together, he tried to hold it together with his own body. But it wasn't enough. Getting Achilles back took gifts, a public apology, and finally the death of Patroclus. Grief succeeding where every offer of gold had failed. Even the most powerful king in Greece couldn't win his war by command. He had to swallow his own pride more than once just to keep his army functional. And eventually, Troy fell. He got everything. The city burned. The war he had paid for with his daughter's life ended in total victory. He loaded the ships and sailed home to Mycenae, expecting to walk into his own hall as the most triumphant king in the Greek world. His wife had spent 10 years waiting for that door to open. Clytemnestra had never forgiven him for Aulis, not for a single day of the decade he'd been gone. She had taken a lover, Aegisthus, consolidated her position, and worked out precisely how it would happen. He came home. She welcomed him. She drew him a bath. And the most powerful king in Greek legend, the man who assembled an unprecedented coalition, sacrificed his own child to launch it, nearly lost it through arrogance, personally carved through enemy lines to save it, and burned one of the richest cities in the ancient world, died wet and unarmed in his own house, killed by the person he had wronged most. Not in battle, not by Hector, not by Paris, not by any Trojan blade, by a debt he'd assumed he would never have to pay. So, was Agamemnon actually formidable? By every measure his world cared about, yes. He built a war from nothing. He kept dozens of rival kings in line for 10 years. He fought in the front rank himself when the strategy collapsed. That is not a figurehead. But the myth is doing something more precise than praising him or condemning him. It's showing you that the ruthlessness that made him powerful and the ruthlessness that destroyed him were never two different things. He was willing to pay any price to command that army. He simply never asked who else would be sending him the bill.